This show, along with hundreds of others from Calaroga Shark Media, is available commercial-free on any player, hassle-free. Just look for the link in the episode or show notes.
Calaroga Shark Media. Hello and welcome to Murder Weekly. This episode is titled The Last Riff.
The dingy walls of the Rusty Nail, a notorious dive bar nestled in the bowels of Lower Manhattan, had seen their fair share of drunken arguments and brawls. But tonight, the air was electric with a particular brand of tension, fueled by cheap whiskey and a fierce debate over rock and roll royalty. Tony, the Shark Sullivan, a hulking Australian with a mane of shaggy blonde hair and a voice that could drown out a jet engine, slammed his meaty fist on the bar. "You're out of your bloody mind, mate," he roared, his words slurring slightly. "Lemmy Kilmister is the greatest bassist to ever walk the earth. The man's a legend, a god among mere mortals." Across from him, Neil, the stink Mazzarelli, a wiry biker from the heart of Brooklyn, sneered through his unkempt beard. "Lemmy, please, that hack couldn't hold a candle to Geddy Lee. Rush is the real deal, man. Geddy's bass lines are like a fucking symphony." The barmaid, a tough-as-nails brunette named Roxanne, rolled her eyes as she wiped down the bar. She'd heard this argument 1,000 times before, usually from drunken idiots who couldn't tell a bass guitar from a broomstick. But Tony and Neil were in a league of their own, their passion for rock borders on the obsessive. "You're both wrong," Roxanne muttered under her breath, her patience wearing thin. "The correct answer is flee from the red-hot chili peppers. But why let facts get in the way of a good pissing contest?" Tony and Neil were oblivious to Roxanne's sarcasm, their attention focused solely on each other. They had been at this for hours, their voices growing louder and their arguments more incoherent with each passing drink. "Lemmy's bass playing is like a punch to the gut," Tony slurred, his eyes glassy with intoxication. "It's raw, it's powerful, it's the heartbeat of Motorhead. Without Lemmy, there is no heavy metal." Neil scoffed, his Brooklyn accent thickening with each word. "You're living in the past, man. Geddy Lee is a fucking virtuoso. His bass lines are like a work of art, intricate and complex. And don't even get me started on his vocal range." Roxanne groaned, the headache building behind her eyes. She'd had enough of this nonsense, enough of the posturing and the dick measuring. She was about to tell them both to shut up and pay their tabs when Tony suddenly lurched to his feet, his bar stool clattering to the floor. "You know what, mate? I've had enough of your bollocks. You want to take this outside and settle it like men?" Neil's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint sparking in their depths. "Thought you'd never ask, you Aussie prick. Let's do this." Roxanne watched in disbelief as the two men stumbled towards the door, their fists clenched and their chests puffed out like a pair of drunken roosters. She knew she should probably call the cops, or at least try to break it up, but a part of her was morbidly curious to see how this would play out. She followed them out into the alley behind the bar, the cool night air a welcome respite from the stale stench of spilled beer and cigarette smoke. Tony and Neil were already squaring off, their faces twisted into masks of drunken rage. "I'm gonna rearrange your face, you pompous wanker," Tony growled, his fists raised in a clumsy approximation of a boxer's stance. "Lemmy's honor must be defended." Neil laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the brick walls. "Bring it on, you overgrown kangaroo. I'll show you what a real bassist looks like." What happened next was a blur of flailing limbs and sloppy punches, a pathetic display of machismo and alcohol-fueled stupidity. Roxanne watched in a mix of horror and amusement as the two men grappled with each other, their insults devolving into grunts and curses, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Tony and Neil lay sprawled on the grimy asphalt, their chests heaving and their faces bruised and bloody. Roxanne shook her head, a wry smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Congratulations, boys," she drawled, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've just proven that you're both idiots. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a bar to close." The next morning, as the sun slanted through the dusty windows of the Rusty Nail, Roxanne arrived to open up for the day. She was still chuckling to herself about the absurdity of the previous night's events when she noticed something strange. Tony and Neil were still there, slumped over the bar in the exact same positions they had been in when she'd left. At first, she thought they had simply passed out, their drunken argument forgotten in the haze of a hangover. But as she approached, a cold sense of dread began to crawl up her spine. They weren't moving, weren't breathing. Their eyes were open, staring blankly ahead in a way that could only mean one thing. "Oh, shit," Roxanne whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Oh, shit, shit, shit." She reached out with a shaking hand, her fingers brushing against Tony's neck in search of a pulse. Nothing. Neil was the same, his skin cold and clammy to the touch. Roxanne stumbled back, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a joke, a sick prank. But deep down, she knew the truth. Tony and Neil were dead, their lives snuffed out in the same dingy bar where they had argued so passionately about bassists and rock and roll. In a daze, Roxanne reached for her phone, her fingers numbly dialing 911. As she waited for the operator to pick up, she couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the empty bar. "Guess the debate's over, boys," she muttered, her eyes welling with tears. Turns out none of it mattered in the end. Not Lemmy, not Geddy, not even fucking Flea. In the end, we're all just meat in the ground. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker, a distant, tinny sound that seemed to come from another world. Roxanne took a deep breath, steeling herself for the inevitable shitstorm that was to come. "Hello, yes, I need to report a double homicide. Yes, that's right, the Rusty Nail, Lower Manhattan. Please, send someone quick. I don't know how much longer I can take this." As she hung up the phone, Roxanne slumped against the bar, her eyes fixed on the lifeless bodies of Tony and Neil. She had always known that working in a dive bar would be a wild ride. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. In the end, all she could do was wait for the police to arrive, her mind spinning with the absurdity and the tragedy of it all. 2 lives, snuffed out over a stupid argument about bass players. It was almost funny, in a twisted, macabre sort of way. But as Roxanne looked around at the dingy, smoke-stained walls of the Rusty Nail, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, a gnawing emptiness that had nothing to do with the 2 dead men in front of her. This was her life, her world, and now it would forever be tainted by the memory of this awful, senseless night. The last riff had been played, and all that was left was the bitter, discordant echo of what might have been.
Murder Weekly is a Calaroga Shark Media production, written and hosted by Aidan I. Flanagan, produced by Mark Francis, executive producers Mark Francis and John McDermott. Portions of this podcast may have been created with the assistance of AI.